Welcome to The World We Got This with Esau Williams.
Hello and welcome back to the podcast with me, Esau Williams. Today we're looking at something that's already shaping daily life across the UK, often in ways we don't immediately see. How does climate change affect the way we live? And how can we adapt in ways that protect the things we value the most? It's about the comfort of our homes, the reliability of our services, the cost of the essentials we rely on, and the places we care about. As the climate continues to change, the mix of impacts will mean adapting together as a nation, as neighborhoods, and in the everyday choices we make. So the big question is how? How does adaptation look like, or what does it look like? How do we overcome the barriers? How do we ensure people can make real choice and don't feel change is imposed? Importantly, how do we support people who make changes they may not want to at first, while keeping things fair? And finally, how do we talk about adaptation in ways that genuinely resonate with the public? To explore these questions, I'm joined by three guests who bring different perspectives. Dr. Helen Adams is Reader in Climate Change Adaptation at King's College London and lead of the MACC Hub, and works on the big picture risks and decisions the UK needs to take. Dr. Giovanna Gini, postdoctoral research associate at King's, whose research focuses on how people experience climate impacts and adaptations in their daily lives. And Chris Pollard is senior researcher at Climate Outreach, who studies how people across the UK understand climate change and what kinds of stories and messages really connect. So together, we'll unpack what's happening and what's coming, what matters the most, and how adaptation can be fair, effective, and grounded in lived experience. So let's begin. Let me come to you, Helen, first to start us off. What is climate change likely to mean for people in the UK, both in terms of direct impacts like heat and flooding, and the more indirect knock-on effects that shape everyday life?
I think you've highlighted two of the big ones there, heat and flooding. I think climate change is going to lead to, in general, our weather to be hotter and drier in the summer, wetter and stormier in the winter. And so things like heat waves will become more common, wildfires that we saw in summer of 2022 when we hit 40 degrees in London, and then floods in winter, which I think isn't something that we're experiencing in the future. I mean, we're experiencing it now, and you just look at the winter and, the problems that they've had down in Devon with the railway lines and things like that. So more of that. And I think the key thing is it's going to keep changing. It's going to keep getting, those impacts are going to get stronger and stronger until we can really stop producing emissions and kind of halt climate change.
And if we stopped, for example, today, can the difference be made immediately? How long will it take for that difference to sort of percolate through?
Yeah, I think it is almost immediate. I've seen some studies where extreme weather events will cease fairly rapidly in a kind of scientific weather way. But yeah, we will see noticeable difference straight away if we can. What I've heard people say is that every part of a degree counts. So if we can stop climate change at 1.5, 1.6 degrees, we'll see a decrease of energy in the atmosphere, carbon will start going down, and we'll start seeing, fewer extreme weather events. But you also asked about the kind of indirect effects, and I think it's interesting to think beyond the UK as well. So a lot of what, you can see that now with what's going on geopolitically, but the UK is reliant on countries all over the world for its food, for its fuel, for its economy. And actually things, for example, like food prices might be affected by climate change, or access to certain resources. And I think we saw that in COVID, and I think that's kind of quite a good comparator to think about how our systems are all really interconnected.
Giovanna, I mean, based on your research into lived experience, which you're doing at the minute, which of these impacts do you think are people already encountering in their homes and routines in their day-to-day lives?
I think that pretty much all of them, because obviously the impacts are distributed. They are distributed in different ways across the population of the UK. So there are populations that are much more vulnerable, as Helen was mentioning. In the heat wave of 2022, we do actually have casualties from people, from people suffering the heat, as well as we have people like losing a lot of properties and maybe not able to recover after floods in different parts of the UK. Something that is also like increasingly worrying is the food insecurity aspect of climate change, and how, as Helen was saying, how also like climate impacts can impact prices, and obviously putting in a context of like multiple crises coming together that very much impact the life and the daily life of people all over the UK.
So you look at the direct impact that climate change has on people's lives. Are you also able to see through your research a sort of a transformation in terms of how we live? Are we more willing than ever before to make those hard choices? I'm thinking of trivial things like, I don't know, paper straws, things that in the past we would buck at and say, up with this, we will not put. Are we more willing to make those transitions and live those slightly more uncomfortable lives?
I don't think that well-adapted UK is uncomfortable per se. I think that we are still
uncomfortable in inverted commas, not my words.
I think that we are still in a phase that we can reimagine futures and reimagine how a well-adapted look like that can be comfortable and can be welcoming for everyone. And I think that's the key now. And I think that there is, despite the different crises that we are facing, I think that there is hope and resistance and resilience from communities, from people. And I think that also that's kind of key, right? The people coming together.
Okay, and let me come to you, Chris, and a slightly related question to the one I asked Giovanna, which is that from Climate Outreach's perspective, how aware are the public of these kinds of impacts, and how do different groups within the public interpret what's happening around them?
The kind of research that we do has asked people what impacts they're worried around for climate change. And the number one that comes through across the board for lots of different groups within society is the impact on nature and wildlife, negative impact on nature and wildlife. It's about 40% of people would choose that as one of their top three impacts that they're worried about for climate change. After that, around a quarter, you get increased risk of floods, increased risk of heat waves, and then things like negative impact on children's future, and also increasing bills and costs. So you see that there's, from a climate outreach point of view, where we're thinking about engaging the public, they're the kind of topics that are really front of mind for what climate is going to be impacting them in the future.
And I just wonder, in terms of messaging, Chris, how has that evolved over time?
Well, where climate outreach came from originally was helping scientists and climate scientists be able to speak better about climate beyond just pointing at a graph and saying, look, this is going to be bad in the future. And it's really about it's matured over the last 20 years. Climate outreach has played a part, along with many others, in trying to really appeal and talk to people where they are, appealing to their values, what's really important to them, what's important in their lives, and saying this is what climate change is. It's a people issue. It's not a science issue. And let's talk about the potential impacts, both positive and negative, of action or inaction, how it's going to affect the people, the things that are really valuable in your life. And in that, by taking that approach, rather than just firing information at people about what's going to happen in the future, numbers and graphs and stuff, you're way more likely to get people engaged, to get people to listen to you, to get people to trust you, and then be able to actually take the action that we need.
And have we managed to take the politics out of this in terms of where, if you're more environmentally friendly, then that's a leftist agenda. If you're more gung-ho, let's, continue as is, then you're more right-wing. Has the politics, the childish politics that is, come out of the discourse now?
That's still hanging around. But, we're really working hard to think about how different people's values relate to climate change. So, of course, those folk who have your stereotypical, maybe pro-environmentalist that you talked about there, maybe leftist. But we know for our research and for others that people with more conservative values, perhaps still really connected to nature, really worried about fairness in society, and those things that Giovanna was talking about, how there are different impacts on different people's in people and society depending on what they have and their ability to adapt themselves. that really resonates, and people across the board, regardless of political persuasion and their values, that really speaks to across the board in many ways.
If you're enjoying this conversation, you may like Spheres of Knowledge, our weekday Substack that explores the ideas shaping the world. Every Monday to Friday, we take one piece of research from the School of Global Affairs and set it out in clear, accessible terms with a focus on the people, questions, and stories behind the work. It's thoughtful writing for curious readers who want a clearer sense of how research connects to everyday life. Search for Spheres of Knowledge on Substack or follow the link in the show notes. All right, Helen Adams, let me come to you now. Given those changes, what does adaptation actually look like in practice from a UK perspective?
I think it's a lot of it that's going on at the moment is about green space and what we call nature-based solutions. So you might see it on near me. They've sort of redone some roads and they've put beds, like for plants to absorb the rainwater. So that's to stop surface water flooding. You might see it in, for example, during heat waves, they have things called cool spaces, which are, libraries, churches, places with air conditioning that are open for anyone to come in when it's really hot to access air conditioning, or I suppose with the church, a nice cool stone building. So it can be things like that, but it can also be policies around creating resilient standards. So, for example, with the transport infrastructure and the railways, it's like, okay, we need to think about a different kind of storm now and protect our infrastructure against a stronger kind of storm, or stronger, different standards where we're building to. A lot of it's around sustainable urban drainage systems. So we call them SUDs. So, you might see with a new development now, they have to build like a sort of pondy area or a sort of drainage site for the water so that goes somewhere. So a lot of them are quite structural at the moment, or they relate to sort of technical fixes. But I think, coming to what Giovanna said, a lot of adaptation is really about building community and, I suppose, engaging. You said, can you take the politics out of adaptation? In a sense, you can't, because a lot of this is about us engaging better with our political system to demand change that protects the things we care about, or demands that the government protect the things we care about. And so, but even if you think about it at a community level, in order for a community to be able to respond well to, say, for example, a flood, they need to know each other. Right, those connections need to be there. So, a big part of adaptation is about, say, for example, social networks and building community, so that when something happens, people can leverage those connections to respond.
And in your view, Helen, you obviously deal with the sort of the big picture and the kind of risks and decisions that the UK needs to take in terms of weathering this change. I just wondered, in terms of dealing with climate change, are we talking now about sort of the restructuring, the redesigning of cities, of places where we live, play and work, or is that debate sort of further down?
I think those changes are always really slow. So I think we are starting now to think about how we live differently under climate change. And I think we can't stop climate change. We can halt some of its worst impacts. But I think there are path dependencies. We can't rewrite history. And so what we can do, and I think pathways are really interesting when you think about adaptation. I think lots of people draw on them as a way of sort of thinking about the future as well. So not only are we have path dependencies from the past, but you can't really plan the future. And so really we have to think in terms of different decision points, different paths that we want to go down that might, say, have a future that's where we really prioritize, like Chris was talking about, fairness, and we really prioritize quality of life. Or do we want to go down a path where we more prioritize the economy, for example? Or do we go down a path that's just kind of burying our head in the sand and not really thinking about the impacts that are coming? And I think that's what's really interesting, is what's happened is that what the models predicted, say, 10, 20 years ago is happening, and it's happening more quickly than they projected. So, we might not be able to mitigate. Maybe that's fine, but really these changes are coming, and the more prepared we are, the more likely we are to be able to use, as Giovanna really argued, adaptation to climate change as something that can make our lives better.
And what kinds of decisions or measures matter most over the coming decades, Helen, do you think?
For me, a lot of what's going on, what we might think are negative climate change impacts, are a lot because we haven't really been maintaining, for example, our infrastructure or maintaining our communities. Now, we all know that we're in a really divided society at the moment. And so for me, the big questions are about actually just looking after everybody in the now. And so, for example, had we invested more in our infrastructure and maintenance, we wouldn't be having so many issues when there were heavy storms. It's not necessarily often that sometimes the storms are worse, but sometimes it's just that our infrastructure is actually just in a really bad shape. So for me, the key decisions are invest in, civic spaces, invest in, our common infrastructure, and invest in our services that we will depend on, get them in a good shape, and get our relationships with each other in a better shape. That's, to me, is where you start, and then you close that adaptation gap.
Right. And Giovanna, I mean, when we kind of hone in to the level of, say, how we live, so homes and streets and other infrastructure, kind of related to what I was just talking to Helen about, what does adaptation actually look like in a practical and a relatable sense? Are we talking about the complete alteration of our streets, for example, and the resurgence of the old cry of not in my backyard, you're not going to, redo the way I live just to make an agenda go forward? Is it as simplistic as that? Tell me.
I think that there are different levels, as Helen was also mentioning, that, when we think about like adaptation, that there can be like different levels of impact or of actions. And I don't think that, so there's a lot of behavior there, right? And I think that that's the faster kind of adaptation that you can do, change your behavior. But also, like, to a certain point, I think that the climate changing is already like a force indicative of changing, if that makes sense, like not necessarily a policy or a society forcing you to change, but simply as like, if it's hot here, I won't touch it, right? And then at home, and I think that this is like, it's funny actually, because sometimes at home, what you can do is go back to your grandparents used to do at home when it is like very hot or when it's raining a lot, this thing of like closing the windows. So coming back to that kind of knowledge that it used to be, used every day and then it becomes unused. So coming back to that, so then not necessarily change, but recovering sometimes knowledge and expertise that we used to have when we didn't have so much commodity perhaps. And also incorporating new strategies or changing working hours and these kind of things can be a first step, which again, it might sound forced, but if you think that, a person who works in the street will be more comfortable working, in the evening rather than at midday or at noon with 40 degrees, it will even be welcoming, I think.
And do all these changes, Giovanna, have to happen at the same time for there to be any considerable impact to make it worthwhile? Or are we talking about, sort of bite-sized changes, bits at a time?
I really like this idea of pathways. And pathway, basically, it sounds very vague and abstract, but basically it's this idea of like, we can imagine a future. We don't really know how to get there, but we keep improving as far as we are doing that path, right? And that means that not necessarily everything needs to happen at the same time. We probably don't know what to do all at the same time, right? It's something that you learn by doing and you adjust by doing and test and error, right? So as far as we are trying to get there, it should be fine, I guess.
Mm-hmm. And Giovanna, another question. So, I mean, you talk a lot about behavioral changes, bringing in these new modifications to the way we live. And again, of course, your research has a lot to do with how people experience the impact of climate change. I just wonder how behaviors have shifted over time. Are we at a point where people feel a greater sense of urgency at the minute? Or is it, again, this is something that just happens naturally, it'll naturally fizzle out?
I think that we have a little bit of everything. I think that we have people who think, for example, a heat wave as an inconvenience that will pass in 2 weeks. For other people, a heat wave is an issue of survival. For some people, there is a true thing like climate anxiety. They think about the future as hopeless. For other people, it's like the state will solve everything, which is not necessarily the case. We need to put, the plans there and try to think all together. And that's also very interesting. I think that about decisions and the way it happens and behavior, I think that is also like the architecture, how we take decisions that needs to be changed. Again, going back to this idea of community and building community, how can we create architecture of decision making that are more horizontal and can represent every sector of society?
What you've just mentioned, you're talking about almost changing how governance work. When you talk about the horizontal decision-making platforms, that's almost alien to a lot of the way governance works at a local level, for example. And I just wondered how difficult a change, again, going back to, people and their behaviors, how difficult a change politically would it be to do such a thing, to make those changes?
That's a good question. Well, I don't want to go all like radical and say like we need to change everything, because it's also not what I believe. Deep inside, I think that there are already so many mechanisms out there that we can use and amplify that perhaps bring this horizontal way of thinking and taking decisions, right? I cannot think at anyone in my mind, but, there are assemblies, you do vote your local government, I think that there is a voting, right? So we do have instruments there. We might need new ones and more, but for the meantime, we can use what we have and as a citizens engaging on those ones, be part of, the council, the assembly, the neighborhood meetings, these kind of things that are already there.
So it basically is on a local level. Okay, Chris, let me bring you in now. When you go across the UK, go across the country, and you talk to people about things like adaptation, do they know exactly what those phrases mean in English?
About half of people will say that they understand the concept or the words climate adaptation together. That's their sort of self-reporting. It might not be the same definition that kind of practitioners and academics and others use. And around another common terms, climate resilience, around the same amount of people would say that. They're both viewed as positive terms in the wider public. People think that it's a positive thing. They're not hearing it and thinking that sounds awful. So that's a good thing. But it's really about, we know from our research, just using, it can be really nice when you're doing communicating to have shorthand, to have a term that you just throw in there and somebody you're speaking to knows exactly what you mean. Oh yeah, I agree. Let's move on to the next thing. But you can go too far with it. And we know that we see agreement and positive responses in surveys and in qualitative research as well, going from this simple technical shorthand, moving to climate adaptation, is something that we're going to do. What are the technical fixes? Talking about the things that Helen and Giovanna have talked about already, like the practical things that are going to happen. And then you get even more support if you start talking about climate adaptation and what it's for, the benefits that you're actually going to bring people's lives that chime with their values. So in terms of communication, when talking about adaptation or resilience and the things that we're going to need to do, making sure that you're hammering home why we're doing it, what's going to be better in your life, what kind of things we're going to save, and it's really appealing to your audience is the key to making sure that people start to link those things about climate adaptation to that positive future.
So basically your messaging has to do with being able to sort of paint a picture in people's minds, but also link it to a positive outcome. And I was just wondering, how, when you use, again, things like climate adaptation, how probably abstract it may appear to a lot of people who are trying to get the message, but think, oh, okay, here come the experts. They're speaking a language. That's for them to sort out. It's got nothing to do with me, Gov.
Well, you're linking it to people's lived experiences, which Giovanna's talked about. What are people seeing in their own lives, in their own communities, and saying that's what climate impacts are. That's what climate change is doing. And from a climate communications point of view, you want to be really clear about the seriousness of what's happening, but you can't just, leave it there and terrify people and expect them to do everything after that. That, you always have to go in there and say, okay, but this is what's actually happening right now elsewhere, not just, what we could do or what you could do, but what is happening elsewhere. Other people like you who share things in life with you. Maybe it's the local area, or maybe it's the things that they enjoy or their interests that they connected to. So communicating about the impacts locally, making it close to home, but then talking about what the adaptation measures are and what they can actually do and other people are doing in the area really gives people the agency and the enthusiasm to take action themselves.
And let's go from the local then to the sort of the more parochial. So if on a local level, people are happy and willing to take those actions that'll bring about the positive changes that you want, on a more macro level, it's going to cost money for local governments or indeed central governments. That's more money, isn't it? It's not a free exercise, is it?
No, actually there are a lot of climate adaptation measures which are very expensive and need to be funded, and we need to find ways of funding that. But there are also many other kind of adaptation actions that can be taken that are a lot less costly and can be taken at community level. Helen was talking about those community networks and, speaking to your neighbours, being able to create those social networks for when, for example, a severe weather incident happens, and then you know who to speak to, and those kinds of things are really low cost but can still are really, really important adaptation measures.
All right, Helen, let me come to you again. So in your view, what do you see as sort of the major structural barriers, if you like, the systemic structural barriers that make adaptation difficult?
I think the one you just raised is a good one. Is this idea that it's an add-on that's expensive to do. I think there's two things there. One, we're not talking about the avoided costs, right? So yeah, it might cost a little bit more, but actually there's lots of studies out there that show, we can see how much a big flood costs, or we can see how much a big storm costs in terms of, people not being able to get to work, building damage, public infrastructure. So that's the first thing. And the second thing is that actually adaptation brings benefits. So a recent study out from the University of Manchester has shown that for every £1 you spend, you get £35 of public value. So it isn't a cost, it's investment. And I think that's the thing we've got to, we're in such a world where we're worried about the cost benefit analysis, but what about the value that we're getting from this? And so I think it's about a shift in the way that we talk about these things. Not everything has to be about making money or getting, it's bringing about something good for society. So I think that's a big one. I think a big one is a lot of the issues that we're coming across here that you're trying to raise with the question. So, there's tons of adaptation actions we can do, other ones that we could, things like not having a paved garden, but putting grass in, or but are all those things really preparing us for the future that's coming? And so I think there's the tension between where are we going and what's the world that we want to have under climate change versus these are all these little things that we can do that just do kind of seem to be about tinkering around the edges. And I think, as Chris is doing a lot of work on how do we get that messaging right and how do we bring that all together, because all of it's important. We need a vision. And for example, the UK, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland have their own national adaptation plans that they put out. England has one too for bits of the UK as well. The England one, the UK one, got criticised because it didn't really present a vision of, okay, what do we want from adaptation? Where are we going? And so, but again, as Chris has talked about, how do we create that vision? Very difficult. So I think there's issues around that anytime you think about the future and what do we want from the future and how do we decide that together through deliberative processes. It's messy. You can't just throw money at it, and there isn't a net zero goal that we can all get behind, a science-based target like there is with mitigation.
And in that vein, do you want to give up then? Because I'm sitting here thinking, when you talk about having a united vision, that implies that everyone is sort of facing the same direction, agreeing wholeheartedly with every step of the process.
Yeah, no, we're never going to get there. And I think that's another shift that needs to happen, is that you can't really focus on the end goal. And this goes back to the pathways idea. You have to focus on the process being fair. So as Chris was saying, how do we bring in everybody with different values, who care about different things, who want different things from life, in deliberative processes, in consultative processes, which are difficult, they're hard. No one wants to engage with someone who doesn't think like they do. I don't. I like being in my little bubble of people who think like me. But, we have to get out and talk to people who think differently and start that process. And I think, so no, I don't want to give up. And I'm very positive about about the benefits that adapting to climate change can bring about. Like the science is there, the knowledge is there. We are trapped in a political economy that, doesn't necessarily prioritize wider benefits for society in its decision-making processes often.
Giovanna, what barriers are most significant, looking, for example, at the household or community level?
There is the hard barriers that are more related to infrastructure, but also like there is a whole complexity there of how to face infrastructure barriers in terms of adaptation at the local level. And then funding, as Helen was saying, and yourself were saying, like it costs money. So that's something that in every survey, in every consultation we do, in every conversation we have is about funding, which is true. But I think it's also about prioritizing choices, and something that comes very, 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 very clear in the kind of research we are doing is like climate adaptation to climate change is still not a priority. In so many, in different barriers and in different decisions. So also I think it's about, prioritizing this decision and these actions that needs to be taken. So maybe the one barrier or one of the biggest barriers, like the lack of prioritization of adaptation to climate change.
And is that where you find the bulk of the debate happening, right when it comes to prioritizing what aspects of climate adaptation should take precedence over which?
Do you mean like what kind of decision should be prioritized in adaptation? I don't think that there is that kind of, or haven't come across. I don't know if any of the colleagues haven't come across what is a priority in between adaptation itself, because I think it's something that varies, right? It will vary according to the location you are and according to the issues you are facing. What will be your priority?
And let me come to you, Chris. I mean, in your engagement work, what kinds of attitudes or concerns tend to hold people back from thinking about acting on adaptation?
Well, one of the biggest ones in adaptation and mitigation actions is thinking that nobody else cares. So we have this kind of pluralistic ignorance. We know that 3/4 of people in Great Britain are concerned about climate and want to see action. But when you ask them, what percentage of people everywhere else in, Great Britain do you think are concerned? Then they think less than half. So there's that big gap between thinking that if you care about climate, you care about adaptation, that it's a niche viewpoint, that you're in the minority. So it's really, really important from a communications point of view to overcome that by carrying on talking about how it is a majority view. Views on climate have changed in terms of climate salience. They move up and down people's priorities when it comes to lots of different political topics. But we still know that a vast majority of people are concerned about climate and want to see climate action.
And I'm going to ask an unfair question, Chris, but of all the methodologies you use, if you had to pick the most effective way, in your view, of communicating that message, which one would it be? Which one resonates the most?
Well, I'm going to pick a couple. So with your unfair question, I'm going to give an unfair answer. But, the ones we go in are the ones where we really focus on appealing to people's values, right? So we think about the different value sets that people might have across society. And then the work we do is often, you might be trying to target one specific group of people about one kind of message. But on this topic, we're trying to have as broad an audience as possible. So you're looking for those topics that engage as many people across all these different value sets. And the ones that hit there are the one I mentioned earlier, nature and wildlife, then things like health, future generations, and that concept of fairness and taking our responsibility for what we're doing as individuals and as a country. And they're the ones that consistently are cut through with the widest range of audiences.
Słuchacie.
Du hörst.
Du hører på. 您正在收听.
You are listening to the World We Got This podcast.
Helen, a common worry about adaptation is the view or the notion that it's going to be imposed upon people, that people are going to lose any sense of agency or ability to make up their own mind their own way. Looking at it from a policy and planning perspective, how can we ensure that people actually do retain that agency?
Some governments are doing a good job of consulting widely. So not necessarily on adaptation plans, but Scotland's got a climate plan, and their climate plan, they're actually paying organizations like community-based organizations to go out and consult and to bring in the views of community and to really make sure that wide consultation isn't tokenistic. I think these tie into broader questions like you've brought up before about like governance and how do we govern, right? And I think if we trust our government to talk to us, to listen to us, and it goes back to what Giovanna was saying about engaging in democratic processes, and if we're holding our public representatives to account, they can't do it. I don't think adaptation is different from anything else that the government might be responsible for. And I think actually there's something really interesting. Who is responsible for adaptation? And I think, like Chris said, or somebody, is it the government? And I think the government can do some stuff, but I think it's also private sector. It's also us as individuals, and where the responsibility lies across government. So in that sense, it's not as if, the state can impose something on us, because it only pulls so many of the adaptation levers, and the rest sit, probably as much with us as consumers as it does with us as citizens.
And since we're talking pretty much about the UK in this, let me add in a naughty question, Helen, because can we then say that the issue of climate adaptability has now risen to the fore of the political agenda? Because guess what? At the Gorton and Denton by-election, the Greens won a highly contested seat. Is that too much? One swallow a summer doesn't make.
Yeah, I wouldn't want to make that link. I think there's two things there. I think probably I would say the Greens winning ties back to this idea of us feeling like kind of investment in things that we value as a society has been a bit low recently. And I think that's probably why the Greens got elected. But I do think, and I think politicians know, that adaptation will rise up the political agenda as we are experiencing increasingly severe and frequent extreme weather events. It can't not. And they're projected to happen. They are happening. We're living it, and more people will experience these impacts and think, why weren't we better prepared? Why were we left in this situation? Where was the government? And I think we'll probably be on the back foot, as you said before, and as we discussed, it would be better if we were on the front foot and prepared. We'll probably be on the back foot, but the more these impacts happen, the more the government will have to prioritize it.
And Giovanna, do people see the issue of climate adaptation, not to put too fine a point on it, but as an existential issue, that this is something that we have to deal with as a matter of urgency, first of all?
I think that it depends of the population. For people that actually, every, extreme weather event is a matter of changing in their life, for sure is something like is about survival, right? Again, heat wave for for older adults, but not only like people who lost their houses or their goods in floods. So these are massive. If you think like these are massive events that can change your life easily, So I think that for people who don't have the choice to ignore climate change, it is an urgent matter. But for sure, it shouldn't be like that. And something that perhaps, when going back a little bit about prioritization, also seeing adaptation as something separate from the rest of the things happening, I think is something that we can challenge as well. When we are planning the city, when we are planning the transport, why don't we think about, is it climate proof? Where is the adaptation? Can this train whatever deal with 40 degrees? These kind of things, I think is important. They bring adaptation into all the different sectors and the way we think about society and how society functions.
And I just wonder, Giovanna, how difficult it is for you to make that point. And I'm going to go very elementary here, because when people experience things like, you talked about the elderly people who bear the brunt of climate change, of course. But when you think about the younger population, for example, where a lot of the change has to be driven from, right? When we talk about climate change, it's not a terrible thing. It's the summer getting warmer. We're experiencing the pleasantries of going out on the town or the city. It's not a bad thing per se. I know it's bad for the climate, but not in terms of people's direct experiences. If we get 18 instead of 12 degrees, for example, we call it a pleasant day. it's not something that we see as immediately dangerous. Does that help make your messaging difficult?
For sure, the idea of having like more sunny days it makes it very difficult, the idea of like adaptation, climate change, and taken seriously. But again, it's not about like, I think that what we need to focus also is like the extreme weather events. Those are the bad guys somehow. But also like you have the slow in changing events like the sea level rise. Like we're talking about towns, communities that, they will face the disappearance of beaches or the flooding, permanent flooding of their towns, right? And these are, these are not funny. and probably it's not decisions that no one, like, the idea of relocating and change your place forever is not an idea that anyone will welcome in, as well. And again, going back to what Chris was saying about like nature and wildlife is about like how many spaces, how many different animals, or how many different ecosystems we will not see anymore because of climate change. So it's also like in terms of future generations, what we are taking from them.
And just quickly again, I mean, in the sort of everyday context that you study, Giovanna, where do you see people genuinely having options on how they adapt? And where do they feel, that they are having lesser or fewer choices?
I think that climate change is scary and it's difficult to deal with when you think in the bigger picture, in the large scale of transformation and change that we need, that we do need, right? Not only like around mitigation and zero emission and these kind of things. But I think that there is always hope when you break down the issue to the local and to the lived experience. And to try to find strategies to, deal with this daily experience in a way that you have also agency and power, perhaps. So I think that, the breaking down of the issue.
And Chris Pollard, let me bring you in on this one, a related question. I mean, on the flip side of all of this, when changes are necessary, but not immediately appealing, if you like, what helps people accept or support it without feeling pushed or patronized?
Yeah, you really don't want to be sort of talking down to people, saying that this is what you need to do, otherwise terrible things is going to happen. We all know that works really badly, and all the evidence shows that as well. It's about showing what the positive things that other people are doing, showing that you can be part of something, not just maybe doing it as maybe as a consumer on your own, but being part of a community, whether that be a local community or an online community, for example, that's taking action together, and giving people the sort of the positive reinforcement of what they're doing is making a difference. And that can be quite hard because if it's a small thing, and climate change is a really big thing, but it's those small things that when you're seeing other people doing similar kind of things to you and being part of something, that's a really positive way of encouraging folk.
And Helen, let me bring you in. I mean, looking across the UK, where do you think we most urgently need to focus on adaptation efforts if we want to protect people's well-being in the long term?
I'll repeat what I said before. I think we've got to invest in our infrastructure, our public services, and our social safety nets that have been eroded over the past 15 years. And that would really be the biggest first step. I think in terms of hazards, Giovanna talked about the slow onset events and heat waves and how we don't take them seriously. But, if floods killed, I heard someone else say this, if floods killed as many people as heat waves do, there would be an uproar. In this stat isn't probably quite correct, but I think in the 2022 heat wave in London, we lost like 250 people. There was 250 excess deaths from that. That's not right. They were preventable deaths, and so I think these kind of the idea of heat as something that's coming for us. And, we like a sunny day, but as soon as how quickly does a British person say, it's too hot, right? There's that fine band of about 10 degrees we're happy in between hot and cold. And so actually we've really got to start thinking, and there's people thinking about this in terms of how we visualize climate change. And so if you think when there's a heat wave on, there's always a picture of people at the beach, right? There isn't a picture of a bunch of Londoners stuck on tubes fainting because, we can't keep the underground cool, And so to me, I think heat's a big one, and then a new risk of fire, which we really haven't had this. I mean, they're sort of grassland. They're not wildfires per se. They're sort of suburban, urban periphery fires. They're new things that we haven't experienced before. But yeah, I think, I was at a talk recently and I heard someone from Wales say that wildfires in Wales are caused by antisocial behavior. They're arsonists. And so, yeah, we can adapt by making sure there's not dry matter. We can do the fire breaks between the forests. But fundamentally, this is a social question. Why are people so disenfranchised and so unhappy that they're doing that? Right. I mean, maybe you could also argue that some arsonists, it's just a psychological thing. But, there's social problems underlying everything. And generally, like you say, with elderly people in heat, why are they alone and why don't they know anybody? And why isn't there social support, or why are they in substandard housing? Or you could think about more rainy weather and the fact that rain's going to fall in more like kind of heavy rainfall events, and mold. We're going to have more moldy houses. And so, but why are people renting? Why are landlords allowed to rent out houses that are full of mold? And why aren't there, regulations in place to stop them? So, but I think for me, it's about, looking after our people now, and reinvesting in the public sphere. And that would really get us a long way.
And Helen, just very quickly, I'm conscious we've got a few moments left on the podcast, but in terms of, I don't want to call it difficulties, but maybe the challenges that you may encounter in getting this message to run, this rate to run, could it be that because of the vastness of its tentacles, I mean, this, you talked about even mold, you talked about the way we live, antisocial behavior. This goes to the very core of our existence and touches almost every facet of our lives. Is that part of the difficulty, that it's so broad in terms of its implications and impact?
Yeah, I think you're spot on. And I think a way of people sort of have always talked about mainstreaming adaptation, and Giovanna touched upon this. I think you can't separate it from something else. It is what we do, and and I've heard other people call it sort of a fundamental prerequisite. Like if you want to achieve what you want to achieve across any sector, you need to think about climate change. And so, I think it comes back to that idea that it doesn't make money for anybody. Adaptation generally saves us money and gives us wider societal values, but isn't necessarily easy to monetize. Mm-hmm. So in our current kind of the political economy we have, which is focused on sort of profit generation, it's very difficult to make the case for it. And yes, like you say, there's no silver bullet. It's across the board. But I think what we've got on our side is that the benefits of adaptation action are evidenced. They're the health benefits we haven't really talked about are huge. The well-being benefits, access to nature, all of that is really, really good for us. The evidence is there. And I think the fact that we won't really have a choice, in a sense, so I think our hand will be, and I think some of the ways people describe it is kind of, what kind of transition do you want? Do we want to be on the back foot or on the front foot?
Okay. And I'll come back for a last round with a naughty question to everyone. But before I do, let me go to Giovanna. What are some of the overlooked benefits, in your view, of adaptation that you think could actually improve everyday life? I mean, I'm thinking in terms of comfort, health, convenience, community spaces, that sort of thing.
For sure. I mean, in the idea, or in the way that we are describing adaptation, this idea of coming back, or the community to come back and create communities, I think that's one of the aspects that is less visible, and it gives so much well-being in all the aspects, right? From start doing things that perhaps you wouldn't do, or just feel part of a group, particularly in a city as London that can be very isolated. I think those are the hidden values and hidden benefits of adaptation in a very simplistic way to put it. And because again, I think that everything is connected to other things. So something that, more green spaces mean that you will have more, better air quality, and your health can improve, or at least not deteriorate, and all these kind of things. So also thinking about cross benefits, of every single action we do.
Mm-hmm. All right, Chris, and just finally, let me just come to you. What do you think meaningful public engagement looks like if we want people to sort of feel a part in shaping adaptation, rather than simply just receiving it as sort of decisions coming from on high?
I think we need to go and talk to people about what matters to them, mm-hmm. and what's important in their lives, the struggles that they face, the opportunities and the joys that they have in their lives, and then really speak about how climate change and climate change adaptation is associated with those things. The flip side of it being such a massive problem that impacts everything is that there are so many amazing opportunities to be able to talk about climate change and climate change adaptation that's actually really meaningful and close to people's lives if you understand, what them and the people that you're meaning to speak to.
All right. And I promised my naughty question. So I'll start with you, Chris, since I just finished talking to you. You look at the phrase climate adaptation, right? And I see that as, it's no change required. I just got to adapt myself to what's already there. So why make any change? Let's just adapt. What say you?
Well, that's right. We just need to adapt. We adapt all the time to things that are happening in our lives, big and small. And that's exactly what we need to do. We know how the things that we need to, from a technical point of view, there's loads of things that we need to do, and we understand how to do them. It's not something that's crazy and going to mean that's undoable, because we adapt all the time.
Giovanna, I know Helen talked about this earlier. What's done is done. But have we just thrown in the towel and saying, well, let's live with however terrible things are and probably just make do, not make any changes?
No, it's not fair. It's not fair. Again, I think it's like the difference is also be a bit more conscious and aware of who we are and who is next to us, right? Because again, for some people, climate change is an inconvenience, right? It means like some days I will be, inside my house. For other people, it's much more serious. And it's just being considerate and aware that people are different and everybody have the right to have to live in dignity and have all the resources to, have a good standard of life. So just being more meaningful about others. And yeah, I would say that.
And finally, Helen, to you, I mean, when you say climate adaptation, again, I'm just putting up with stuff. I'm not making any changes. I may even contribute negatively towards it, but I'm still putting up with that.
Yeah, and I think that's why, we could get into different ways in which you call adaptation. There has been a move recently to think about it in a bit more of a nuanced way, because you are right, you can cope, which is just, I would say coping's maybe what you're talking about, sort of absorbing it. Then you can adapt, which is like, well, I'll change some stuff. But then you can think about actually, how can I make sure this doesn't affect me in such a negative way in the future? And that requires these kind of deeper changes. And so I would say you're right there on the term adaptation. In sort of common parlance, common discourse, it means something quite incremental. But I think Giovanna hit on the point about fairness and the fact that some people experience it much worse than others. And that's both within the UK and between the UK and other countries. But I also think the adaptation gap is growing. And so our ability to keep up with climate impacts is like we're not keeping up with climate impacts. Basically, our ability isn't there, and so we do have to change something. So you're right about the terminology that we're using.
All right, Dr. Helen Adams, reader in climate change adaptation here at King's College London, Dr. Giovanna Gini, postdoctoral research associate at King's, and Chris Pollard, senior researcher at Climate Outreach. Ladies and gentlemen, before we wrap up, we'd really value your thoughts on today's episode. We've put together a short listener survey to understand how these conversations land with you. What feels relevant, what surprised you, and what you'd like to hear more about. Your feedback helps us shape future episodes and ensures we are talking about adaptation in ways that truly connect with people's experiences. The link is in the show notes. Thank you for the privilege of your company. And thanks for being on the podcast.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.